The idea that the world exceeds story is the invitation to consider that story centralizes in some senses, but the world is more than that imperative of centrality. The world has multiple agencies. It is not just human agents that are, in the center of the room. We are crowded, if you will, populated by many others with their own services, with their own mute agencies, with their own microbial activisms, right? And so to insist that we have it all together is to live within modern civilization. That is part of the effective acculturation of living in the city, that I can eventually have it all together. I can amass knowledge to myself. I can know things. I could get an education, a PhD and a post-PhD, if you will. I could read and read and read. It is traditionalist, humanist education. The idea that I can, or thinking rather, that I am self-evident and that I am not indebted in any way to ecology, to architecture, to the world around us. We are constantly beleaguered and haunted by things that we habitually exclude from the streams of consciousness that we call the human subject. We've learned how to do it, to compartmentalize the world and to keep business as usual. Many people have been denied access into human, and I'm saying right now that the climate disaster is only for humans. There are more than human communities, and there are ways of reframing these modern instigated anxieties. The circuitry of the human subject, especially the human subject conditioned by the city, is largely clear. Make a name for yourself, gather stuff to yourself, get married, blah, 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 live, die. That's the way of the world. Get educated, get a degree, stuff like that, to varying degrees. But it's not quite clear when we really stop to consider some of the details. When I speak about cracks, I often theorize events that are so ontologically disruptive that they throw us off. We're not able to think again, and suddenly we are upended by this explosion that changes us and turns us into monsters. It's like a metabolic rift, a disabling transversal event that drives us deep into postures of humility, where we learn to listen again. When people hear me speak about cracks, they immediately imagine a huge, spectacular event, like the pandemic, or like an extraterrestrial slave ship dipping through the clouds, coming to steal human bodies. Cracks, to me, are not spectacular events necessarily. They are sites of excess, where the world cannot contain itself, where the designations of modernity, the way it names things, where things spill out of their containers and become something we don't expect. So I feel that cracks are invitations for us to practice different kinds of inquiry. How do you stay with failure? How do we stay with the failure of our species? How do we stay with the failure of climate chaos and all of that, racial injustice? How do we stay with this failure without rushing to put a band-aid with workshops that teach sensitivity to police officers and stuff like that, so we can just march on with business as usual? How do we open ourselves, be a little bit more vulnerable and fragile to other messages of our time? This one is making rounds, and it's at the heart of what I call post-activism. What if the way we respond to crisis is the crisis? What if we are embedded within algorithms of actions and reactions that only go so far to reinforce a terrain of behavior where solutions are already in league with the problems they're supposedly canceling? What if behavior is not ours? What if we act with the world? What if we're acting with other forces, other arrangements, other containments? The real violence that was done to Africans wasn't the slave ship. The slave ship was only part of it. The vessel of capture was the human individual. the human individual as the thing that you are now going to fit within. The worlds that we lived in, and I'm not trying to create some revisionistic or originalism that we ought to return to. I don't think of the world in that way. It's not a binary. There's nothing pure to return to. We saw ourselves together with mountains. There wasn't a private sense of self. There still isn't in many parts in, at least where I come from. There isn't some private interiority that I'm supposed to tend to. So that is the burden of post-activism, to ask such seditious questions, and then as a result to seek cracks and breakaways and breakthroughs and rifts and anything that might allow us sneak out of a plantation, this way of acting that is repetitive and toxic, to sneak out of this plantation and refuse to grant it our labor. This is the work of fugitivity. This is the work of marronage. What if success is a kind of failure today? And this might not be a good thing to tell people who have just succeeded, but I would like you to lean into failure and what failure might be teaching us today. There are many other imperatives at large beyond, our vocations. And maybe this is the time to stop being impervious to these other voices and agencies at large and to listen deeply for what might want to happen. Well, systems are linguistic conveniences. We chart out algorithms, and systems are largely human matters of language, matters of human created terms and formulas. But the world exceeds systems. This might not be acceptable to modern cosmoperceptions. Liberal humanist modernist thinking situates humans at the center of the room. We are in charge. We are agentially superior to all other kinds of life on the planet, and we live on the planet quite literally. We are not the planet in its ongoing materiality. We are literally on the planet. And so we think in terms of this linear space. We live in this tiny humanist bubble, and we deal with the marks on the bubble, the hieroglyphics on the bubble. Post-humanist thinking, animist thinking, even Yoruba indigenous invitations are suggestions that the world is too unwieldy to be systemic. The world is too messy, too promiscuous, too agential to be predictable. And I'm trying to say that there are other moves to be made, especially in times like this, times of fissures and cracks and fault lines. And what those things do is that they upset the coherence of the body. This is a crisis of form. And so we're now diasporic. Our bodies are disorganized. We're disarticulated by the pandemic, by the Anthropocene, by racial issues, by poverty, by all these things that we name as crises. But the issue here is that we tend to repeat and reinscribe these crisis events, even in our best efforts to resolve them, because we're still stuck within the same epistemological space. Even with justice, injustice requires justice to function well. It's no longer justice versus injustice. It's justice hyphen injustice. That these systems call upon each other. Even the state that guarantees or attempts to guarantee justice is already a bedrock of violence, is already a bedrock of displacement and annihilation and invisibilization. So we need probably to go beyond critique, go beyond justice, and maybe edge towards experimental liminal spaces of transformation. And that requires a different kind of move and thinking altogether. It requires getting lost. The climate disaster, we lose sight of the fact that we are way in over our heads, and we're dealing with something that is, in my calculations, fundamentally incalculable. It is unframable. It is something that calls for a shape shift. When I say that I reject humanity or that I'm speaking not as a human, I'm trying to shine light on how more than human we are, or how post-humanist we are. That the human is a Euro-American creation. It is not just a concept. It's not just the bipedal figures that we associate ourselves with. It is a territory of acting and becoming and thinking. The human is the extractivist politics that thinks we can build and build and build towers like Babel and gain linguistic superiority in an ongoing fashion without stopping forever. The human is the transatlantic slave trade. The human is the westward pushing of the pilgrims on the so-called New World to find gold or to find home or to find acceptance and recognition. It is the transhumanist vocation to continue to build until we reach a singularity. And I think fugitivity and rejecting the human is about losing our way, meeting the world in a way that hacks that algorithm. What does the human, as in the city, as in the nation state, invite us to do? What does it invite us to notice? And then how do we notice differently? So this is how I want to invite this post-humanist politics, hopefully an emancipatory politics of acting that goes beyond the tropes that we're used to. The world has ended many times before. This isn't new.